It's not calling you Josh Frydenberg, it's calling you Dosh Frydenberg.
Under the Coalition, taxes for hard-working Australians will always be lower.
You know, I don't hold a hose, mate, and I don't sit in the control room.
They're answers that only can come from Victoria, I'm afraid, because that's not my job.
But I ain't spending any time, though, because in the meantime, every 3 months, a person was torn to pieces by a crocodile in North Queensland.
Well, g'day listeners and welcome once again to the Two Jacks. It's episode 107 and we're keeping forging on after making a ton. Joining me as usual is Hong Kong Jack. G'day mate, how are you?
Good, apart from one bung eye, as you might see.
Oh, you do have a bit of a black one there. Have you been walloped? Have you been quilted in the street?
Well, I was going to say, you should see the other fella. He hasn't got a mark on him. But no, I had what my mother used to call a bit of a turn, you know.
Did you?
Bleary-eyed and very dizzy and stuff. I didn't fall over or anything, but then a little bit later, this appeared in the eye, or the first bit appeared, and the blood just kept going down. So I had to have a CT scan of the brain just to check that there was no further damage, no stroke, etc., etc. So I asked the fellow to check whether I'd turned MAGA, whether my brain had turned MAGA while he was doing it, you know, for free.
You know, you'd wear the red cap into the CT scanner.
And he says, no, you're completely clear of MAGA, you know.
Well, there you go. Well, it is a disease, as we know. And it's probably the first major scandal, political scandal, facing the Trump administration now. And this is the business of the 18-member Signal chat discussing a strike on the Houthis in Yemen that also included the editor-in-chief of the Atlantic, Jack.
Not a publication friendly to the Trump administration,
No,
you'd say.
In fact, when Trump was asked about it, he clearly didn't have a clue, but he just gave the Atlantic a bit of a swipe anyway. So that was Jeffrey Goldberg, who found himself being invited into the Signal group chat. Obviously, one of those little errors, you flip through the phone or you flip through your contacts, you can get Signal on your desktop as well. And they've just punched in the wrong name. And he's just sat there watching them discuss a strike on Sana'a, the capital of Yemen. And 2 hours later, there it was. The strike it came. The people included in the chat includes there are a number of other, I guess, relatively minor officials. Was Vice President J.D. Vance, Secretary of State Marco Rubio, Secretary of the Treasury Scott Bessent, who didn't contribute at all, Secretary of the Defence Pete Hesketh, as far as we know, Director of National Intelligence Tulsi Gabbard, who's struggling a bit in front of the Senate Intelligence Committee hearing, and John Ratcliffe, the director of the CIA, also there, White House Chief of Staff Susie Wiles, and her deputy, Stephen Miller, known as SM. And
Mr. Goldberg, the journalist.
Mr. Goldberg just sitting very quietly there as JG. Maybe they thought, Julia Gillard's popped in for a briefing.
Some of the more excitable people on Twitter have been suggesting that Mr. Goldberg should have realised he was on some kind of a, perhaps not classified, but secure chat, and immediately left the chat to do the right thing by the country. And I was trying to think, would there be a single reporter or a journalist that I know who would get off a chat like this?
Only the bad ones, Jack.
Yeah.
Only the bad ones.
I mean,
there was, in fact, a bit of excitable
story.
stuff. I saw someone suggesting that the editor-in-chief at the Atlantic, Jeffrey Goldberg, had committed treason, Jack. He'd committed treason by just hanging in the group chat.
Yeah. Well, that's if you start saying things like that, you've kind of lost your marbles a bit.
Yes, indeed. It would seem that the invitations were all sent out from the office of Trump's national security advisor, Michael Waltz. And the chief villain of the piece is said to be an unnamed staffer in that office who's pressed the wrong button. Interesting, a bit of character assessment about Michael Waltz, Jack.
It's always an unknown staffer, isn't it?
Yeah, well, I think he'd be getting a serious ass kicking right now, wouldn't he?
Yeah.
But Waltz himself, the National Security Advisor, Michael Waltz, is a former highly decorated officer, special forces and all that sort of stuff, was described in another anonymous White House insider who offered the keen character assessment. Everyone knows he's a fucking idiot. and he certainly talks in that, that sort of military bureaucratic way. I don't know if you looked at some of the exchanges and some of his input. But yeah, it was all very military. Now we've got the Houthi small group stuff going there. So the problem they're going to have, because they're actually Gabbard and Ratcliffe have both been saying, "Well, no, I don't believe it was confidential or secret. The information was going on," and you go, "What, really?" As you're 2 hours before a military strike on a foreign country, you're going to have to say that's probably got the skull and crossbones, big red top secret stamp on it. But they've sort of thrown Hesketh under the bus a bit there, because they're saying it's his job to announce what it is, to announce its security status. And then, of course, the Atlantic didn't publish the material but Goldberg has said it included targets, what weapons were used, what basically the sortie, all the details of the sortie, and he's got screenshots to prove it. They just didn't publish that stuff. So I don't know what happens in Trump land right now. Does anyone get rolled? They're going to try and tough it out, aren't they?
Well, firstly, I think for Goldberg's case, you would never get off the call because you would want to know what was going on. Yeah. Any reporter, as I said, worth his salt.
Well, you'd never just pipe up in the group chat either. How are we, guys?
Of course you would.
From the Atlantic here.
Of course you wouldn't. But you'd also err on the side of caution and not publish the material.
And they did, yeah.
So as far as I'm concerned, he seems to have, it's on what we know at the moment, he seems to have done the right thing. Where will it all end up? Probably nowhere, is my suspicion. That's what normally happens with these things. If you're a junior person who mishandles classified stuff, you get the chop,
You get the chop and you get investigated.
And you might even end up, playing golf at a federal prison for a while. But if you're far enough up the food chain, no, it doesn't.
Yeah, you would think they'll try and tough this out. One of the more intriguing conversations, Jack, was introduced by Vice President Van. He hinted at basically sending the Europeans the bill for the strike on the Houthis.
Yeah, good luck with that.
Well, just seemingly unaware that in that particular sortie, British refuelers were made available to the fighter jets, and of course the Brits themselves, the RAF, have had strikes on Houthi rebels in Yemen in previous weeks and months.
I didn't read closely, but I scanned through the documents concerning the signal messages.
Yeah.
And I just sort of thought, well, Vance seemed to be under the impression that the taking out of the Houthis was solely related to freeing up the
Suez,
the Suez Canal, Red Sea cargo route. But I think I didn't think it ever was. I mean, I think that's part of it. It certainly is part of it, but it's also because the Houthis are a proxy for Iran. It was to hurt Iran, to try and push the Middle East back into a better balance.
Yeah,
and that's in America's interest probably more than it's in Europe's interest.
We did see Hesketh respond to that by respond to Vance's comment by saying, "Oh, look, the first thing, he's running through the options, Jack, pros and cons, to bomb or not to bomb, and he says if this leaks, will look indecisive. I said, well, indecision's probably the least of your worries right now. But he also said that the Israelis might do the strike first, and they'd lose all the credit for it.
Yeah. Well, he's right that indecision does make you look foolish. This is one of those situations where would you rather be wrong or would you rather be guilty of a cock-up?
Oh, well, this is definitely a cock-up. You can't explain it any other way except to say, I looked at this fairly comprehensively, that the DOD and the CIA, they have absolute rules about comms, about communications at this sort of level, in fact, at any level within their jurisdiction, and that is to use the existing closed networks that they have. I think one's called JCINT. There are a couple of other names for the ones that they're supposed to use. So they, for whatever reason, have just decided to jump into Signal. Now, Signal's a very good, journalists use it a lot. I use it a bit. It's encrypted end-to-end. Messages will disappear after a fixed period. It doesn't help much if someone's sitting in the group chat. It just doesn't matter.
And even though it's encrypted, it's not as secure as the, I'm told, rather clumsy in-house stuff that they can use. So it's more difficult to use. But
well, yes, they need to have an assistant come and set it up for them.
Yeah, that's right.
And obviously not with their own phones.
No, that's correct.
President Trump's special envoy to the Middle East, Steve Witkoff, Jack, he was in Moscow when he logged on to the group chat. So probably Vladimir Putin would have watched it all on his phone.
Yeah. Well, with someone in the what's it called, the FSB.
Yeah, I will. Someone would say, Vladimir Putin, do you want to turn the bear baiting off on the telly and have a look at this? Tulsi Gabbard, she hasn't said where she was. I guess it's findable, but she didn't say where she was. But she was also overseas at the time she logged on. So every single one of their phones, 18 phones, was off in gangster parlance, Jack. Yeah, look, it is a stuff up. And probably the most amusing thing, I've got to say this, Pete Hesketh, he arrived at Pearl Harbor off the flight, and somewhere between the time the plane landed, reporters were informed that the White House had confirmed that the signal messages were genuine. But he didn't seem to know, and when he got off the burner, he was assaulted by a gaggle of reporters. And what did he say? Let me find it. Nobody was texting war plans, and that's all I have to say about that. Unfortunately, 5 minutes before, the White House had said, yeah, it's all fair income. So he looked a bit silly. Did you look at his hair, Jack? Did you have a good look at his hair?
Yeah, I saw your comment on Twitter, but I'm backing my man in this battle.
Well, yeah, he's got good hair.
But listeners, my man is Gavin Newsom. He's got gubernatorial and perhaps presidential hair.
Oh, I don't think anyone around the world comes close to Ajay Deja, Jack. That is a magnificent head of hair.
Yeah, that's pretty good.
Magnificent head of hair. Anyway, Hexeth had seemed to have just gone bananas with the pomade. It was thick on the head. Perhaps he thought it was alcoholic, and he might get a little bit of intoxication through the scalp. Very, very funny, I think. It's just one of those things that just made me laugh and laugh and laugh. I had a difficult day yesterday, listeners, doing a pretty heavy sort of interview, and I was just about shot at the end of it, and then I picked up I was a bit slow to pick it all up, but there it was, and it was a manna from heaven, Jack. So that we'll get back to the States and various things there, but that was just the great story. We're going to go to Australia, of course. Still no election called, Jack. The Allen government, the one saving factor, of course, is that the Victorian Liberal Party are absolutely dreadful. But they have got some huge problems. Jacinda Allen the Allen government has got huge problems on at the moment. I'm not sure if you saw the 60 Minutes episode of a week ago when you've got, filming these thugs, these CFMEU employed thugs, outlaw motorcycle gang guys severely beating a woman. And this woman, single mother of a couple of kids, she's been told she's basically persona non grata in the construction industry, and that's the only skill she's got.
Yeah, I saw enough of the 60 Minutes to see how...
He's done terrific work, Nick McKenzie, over a long time.
Yeah, and this, not like this, but there's always been a bit of a problem with the building unions in Victoria. Building is expensive, much more expensive in Brisbane and Melbourne than Sydney, say, for instance.
It certainly seems to have elevated to a new level, Jack.
But it has gone to a new level, yeah. I mean,
of course, the Allen government has suspended CFMEU, the building element of the union, but not expelled.
Yes.
So Labor does always have this problem of a sort of connective relationship between itself and the CFMEU in some of its more violent manifestations.
Yeah. When I had a bit to do with the building industry in Victoria, the Builders Labourers Federation were the union who caused the difficulties, but they were not doing this sort of thing.
No, this is next level.
Yeah, it is. This is indeed next level. I mean, the BLs, there was a bit of intimidation and coercion, et cetera, but they didn't have outlaw motorcycle gang members beating up women on sites. Nothing like that at all.
It begs the question about the cost of construction, mate, but particularly around major projects. Let's put housing construction to one side. But when we get to these major projects and the contracts that are signed and people, I have no problem with builders' labourers earning $150,000 a year, Jack. No worries about that at all. But if you've got corruption within that union, and clearly there is, you could basically modestly assign, an additional 15% of cost to this corruption in any major project you can think of in Victoria or New South Wales, for that matter.
Yeah. Can I just say, I've got no problem with the builders' labourers earning $150,000 a year, but if they're the blokes who are turning up.
Yeah, that's what I mean too. Yeah,
if they're not
actually, it's like the old painters and dockers where you'd have one bloke who just clock everyone on, and clock them off at the end of the shift, and they never actually turn up. Yeah,
the cost of construction is really important, and it really doesn't affect. This is not something that affects single house construction, for instance,
that's right.
Because the union coverage in single house construction is pretty spotty, right? But it does affect all of the big building projects,
big infrastructure builds,
particularly the big government infrastructure projects. This is a real problem.
Massive problem, because as taxpayers we are paying. Well, I'm not a Victorian taxpayer, but those Victorian taxpayers are probably paying 15%. That's very modest, sort of back of the envelope calculation.
Probably worse than
the cost of their construction. I would think it'd be worse, but that's a modest sort of calculation.
And Jacinta Allen, unfortunately, seems too close to the union movement, to the unions concerned, and she doesn't do her preparation work. So she's looked quite a fool when she's done press conferences, because she said things that were, the journalists just knew weren't true. That they've been, and she's managed to get rid of the two most senior police officers in the state.
Yes,
pushed them out. It all looks a lot like a shambles. A lot of people were critical of Dan Andrews, and there were things to be critical of him about.
Sure.
But he was always prepared when he went into these press conferences. One of the reasons he was so good successful during the COVID thing was that He was on top of his brief, and she clearly is not on top of her brief at all. In fact, I don't think she survives this.
Really?
Yeah.
I think there's so much going on in Victoria at the moment. As I say, politically, in terms of election outcomes and so forth, I mean, you're going to. The situation is so bad that you've got Labor that is a tired government that really needs to be removed at the next election by the voters, and then you've got an alternative that is just it would be an absolute clown show having them in government.
All they've got to do is stay upright and they win, I reckon. Yeah, I think the Labor government now is on the nose.
They've got so much. They've got such a big. Excuse me. They've got such a big swing to get across, Jack. It's almost like it has to be 2 terms before they can get there.
Yeah, I don't think that she will take the party to the next election. There you go.
Oh, okay. It's a good tip. I won't say whether I agree or not. We will see about that. They need to fix that. They need to fix a lot of these problems. We've talked about some of them, particularly around policing. They've got major crime issues around home invasions. Most of the crime stats are pretty stable, except for these sort of break-and-enters, aggravated burglaries and things like that.
Yeah.
Mainly.
And your newspaper's done some good stuff on a particular problem with a relatively small group. I think they're Sudanese young fellows who are in the Housing Commission flats in Fitzroy and somewhere else, I think.
Look, we talked about this last week. We are talking about relatively small numbers.
Yeah.
And so the way to deal with this is almost an old policing way, and that is you remove them, you take them off the streets.
Yep.
And for those that
take the key people off the streets.
Take the key people off the streets, hang them out by their ankles from the top story of St Kilda Road, and make them see the light. And
what's the old joke about the young constable on his first day in the station, and the sergeant says to him, "Get me a phone book. You know, I'm going to give this bloke a bit of a working A with the phone book." And the young bloke says, "What? 80K?" Elder said, "Don't care, mate. Just give me a phone book."
That coincides with the time that police brutality sort of diminished in Australia when we went to the A to the K to the LZ, because before that, just a one big volume, you could do some damage with that. Yes, it is sort of one of those things where you need some old sort of school policing. I think,
and the Premier seems to have no working relationship with the police. In the midst
the police themselves just are all over the place.
Yes,
and that's a real problem. They seem to be leaderless. I heard, as I said, I've used this stat before. You've got in a large chunk of outer suburban Melbourne in the east, and you've got 2 squad cars or 2 divvy vans for about 80,000 people.
Mm.
I mean, you just know if you've got a report a matter, it could be a domestic violence matter, it could be something that needs to be attended to urgently. It's not going to be attended to urgently.
Mm.
That's not the fault of the police, by the way. That is really a problem with morale and a failure of government, really.
Mm.
All right,
and quite probably too many police in the office.
So when we had you remember the Wood Royal Commission going back to New South Wales, Jack?
Yeah.
Many, many years ago. One of the things that the Wood Royal Commission recommended was that increasingly police leave their cars and do commence foot patrols, particularly around what they call hot zones or red zones, where historically there have been large numbers of property crime and assaults and muggings and these sorts of things. But if you're in the police force, mate, you like being in the car.
Yeah, that's a problem.
That is a bit of a problem, and there's much to be said for a lot of pedestrian policing, walking the streets. You get to know the locals. You get to pick up a bit of information. Yeah, and it's a really good thing. However, no one, I suppose, wants to work and basically walk 20, 30 Ks a day on the step. There's got to be a better solution to it, Dave. But yeah, the police union up here, and once these recommendations were made over 20 years ago now,
It's part of it's
the police union just said, "Well, you got to be kidding! We're not doing that."
yeah, yeah. Part of it's the technology. They think they can do everything from one spot.
Yeah, I suspect presence is far more important, particularly when you do have these things are very solvable. It's not as if it's just the way society is going to be from now on in. These things are very solvable. You've got relatively small groups. I'm talking about the Agbergs in Melbourne. These things are very, very, as you say, in military terms, you cut it off and kill it, and and that means incarcerating a few, the 17-year-olds and so forth. They go into adult prisons, and good luck.
Yeah, this you spend a fair bit of time in hospital. In fact, we both have. This happens in hospitals too with nursing. That these days it's very easy for a nurse to spend most of their shift sitting at the computer monitoring stuff, whereas you actually need people to go out on the ward and talk to people. Particularly when you've got the elderly or people who are very ill and become not great communicators. If you want to do a better job, you've got to get them off their chair and get them walking around and talking to people.
Yeah, I thought you were going to say something else about hospital systems. I took my daughter; she'd had her tonsils out in her early 20s, and there was still some issues related to it. So we had to take her to, I can't remember why now, but we ended up at Liverpool Emergency. And, mate, that is one of the, not scariest places, but just an awful, awful place to be. And terrible workplace. You got, Jess and I were sitting next to a man in custody who looked like he'd given the heroin a nice old touch-up in recent times. People screaming and yelling at nurses and so forth, and you virtually have to have, in these major hospitals, you have to have a police presence in the emergency.
You've got to have security, of some kind.
Well, security, they'll just, the number of assaults on nurses, on security staff in hospitals and so forth, people know he's not a cop, he's just security, so I can bash him. Nothing much will happen. Yeah, all right. Yeah, there's a lot to unpack with the Allen government, isn't there? I mean, she's got a long history with the ETU, which is kind of, it's a fairly radical left-wing union, isn't it, Jack?
Yep, it is. And it was way back in my day,
Yeah, always has been. What was the bloke? They did a naked calendar, didn't they? He was a cricketer. He played a bit of decent cricket on the weekend. What was his name?
I can't remember his name now, but he
did. They did the new calendar.
I think he was always either resigning or being expelled from the ALP. I can't remember his name now.
Yeah, same sort of thing. Look, I know a number of guys who are members of the ETU and they swear by it, and it is in competition with the CFMEU. I'm not quite sure what the nature of the relationship is, whether they tend to ignore one another or tolerate one another. But you can see in that the E in the CFMEU is related to electrical trade, so they're both dipping in for members.
This has been going on for 125 years, the battles within a bit longer within and between the unions. In my day, it was the Builders Labourers Federation and the Building Workers Industrial Union, and the ETU and the carpenters and joiners, and they were all battling over the same workforce.
Yeah, so you still have that, even though you've got your super unions now.
Yeah,
I see Mick Gatto. I mean, he's almost been bulletproof. Even when he had a bit of a tussle with Benji Venyman, who wasn't bulletproof, we discovered, and I think he's looking at. I mean, if there's going to be any proper inquiry, he's got a lot to answer for. In fact, I'll go so far as to say the Building Royal Commission was a Dyson. I was going to say Dyson Heppel. Dyson. What's his name?
Not Dyson Hall Lacey either. No. He's the Melbourne Silk. I've forgotten his name now.
Yeah, former High Court Justice. And it was a complete joke. I kept saying, I just remember talking to these right wingers they're cheering it on, and I go, "Where's Mick Gatto? Why isn't he in the box?" and he was all over the evidence. So look, this is what needs to happen. You need to have a Royal Commission, and that wouldn't save Alan. That'd probably destroy her. But that's what needs to happen, in my view.
Yeah, well, I'm sure there's probably 10 or 20 lawyers sitting around in chambers in Melbourne listening to this going, what a good plan that would
What a good plan. Oh, there's my superannuation.
Thank you. There's my house down at Lorna or Rye or somewhere, you know.
Yeah, Portsea and Sorrento's the place to be now, Jack. Yeah. Sorrento looks rather lovely. All right, so where to next? The budget? Yeah. I am at something of a disadvantage. I know there
was a budget.
I did know there was a budget, and mercifully, my editor contacted me and said, "Can you write about the Signal national security leaks?" And I went, "Your beauty, thank God I don't have to write about the budget because it is so boring."
It is.
They've thrown a little bit of money the punters' way, but also they've had to concede that there are deficits as far as the eye can see, Jeff.
Yes. Over the horizon. I watched a bit of it last night and I read about it this morning. My only comment would be this is a Malcolm Fraser and a later years of the John Howard government and all that's gone be since.
Beer down, Jack. Beer down.
Yeah, it's just handing out a few little gewgaws. It's like going to the sideshow alley at the show. You know, every player gets a prize, right?
Participation award.
Yeah, there's nothing of the Paul Keating about this. Keating would have said,
"We haven't had economic reform in this country for 20 years, mate."
And part of the problem is that both the major political parties have sort of memory hold the fact that they had people, you know, Hawke, Keating and Howard, who supported economic reform. Now no one wants to have a thing to do with it. I mean, Keating would have stood up and said, this is the problem we've got with our economy. This is what I'm going to do to fix it. It might actually cause a bit of hurt in the meantime, but I've got a plan to fix it. None of that. Absolutely zero of that.
Well, I mean, it might be a little bit harsh there, Jack, because they really didn't want to. They really didn't want to have a budget, and I, you know, the current wisdom is that had the storm around Brisbane and the northern rivers of New South Wales not come to be, then we would have gone without one.
It would have been on our way to an election by now.
Yeah. As it stands, it may look to be about May 17. That's my current tip for the election.
Yeah. One of the things that disturbs me about budgets in Australia generally is that all of the coverage about them is centred around, will you as an individual be better off or not? Even your newspaper, The Australian, had this little pop-through thing from KPMG where you could fill in the form online and it would tell you whether you were better off or worse off. And that's not what a budget's supposed to be about. It's not supposed to be about handouts to the people.
Why not, mate? Taxpayer money, give it back.
Don't take it in the first place would be my answer to that.
Oh, there you go. So, I mean, what are we going, trickle down now, or what are we doing there? I mean, look, I sort of understood the scope of this particular budget, given the timing, that it was going to be a few little throwaways, and not much else, and you know, and also having to concede the fact that there are budget deficits, you know, for at least the next 6 years.
Yeah, and from the budget's own figures, we know that the NDIS is going to be a problem that's going to have to be addressed.
Yeah, and there's been very little touching up there too, Jack. But yes, the expenses. In fact, you know, Bill Shorten actually, before he left the Parliament, said, "Here's some reforms," but they've just sort of backed away from them.
They have.
I guess what Shorten was recommending was a question of timing too. It's again at the wrong end of the electoral cycle, I dare suggest. How are they looking, Jack? How's Labor looking?
My view probably hasn't really changed. I think they'll scramble back into minority government.
You think minority? Their primary vote. Well, they won the election with a majority with 32.5, I think it was. Primary vote. They're currently around 31. So that, if I just look at news polls over the last last month or so, I see a bit of a revival. I see the opposition going backwards in a number of areas. There's a little bit of a concern that they are playing this small target strategy and it all looks too clever and won't really announce some of the things they're going to do, like public service cuts. And they've really got we talk about reform, they've really got no economic reform or really a properly enunciated economic policy, Jack.
No.
Found out a bit.
My criticisms of the budget lacking a bit of Paul Keating apply to the opposition as well.
Well, Peter Dutton will have his chance to have a crack tomorrow. There has been concern expressed in the back rooms by people like Angus Fraser and others that Peter Dutton is failing to provide a proper agenda for their election.
There's
and
something
he has gone
in
backwards in his approval ratings as well.
Yeah, there's something in that. I think they've both gone backwards, haven't they? Both he and the Prime Minister.
I see he was in the positive. Maybe not a news poll. Essential had Elbow +1. He was approved of more than he was disapproved of by a factor of 1. And but Dutton's remains pretty stubborn. It's almost like we're headed to an election, Jack, where there's no great interest. The major interest will be what the minor parties are going to do, how the Greens are going to go, how will Fon go in Queensland, because they've gone backwards in the last couple of elections, state and federal. How will the trumpet of patriots go? Not well, I suspect, but that's the only bit of fascination there, because you've got the coalition on about 37 and you've got Labor at 32. You're still nudging that 70% figure that we've been around for a little while, just under it. But Labor gets 32, 33. They'll actually get their majority back. Well, it depends on where the votes fall, I suppose. But I think if you're a Labor fan, you feel a little bit easier about things than you did, let's say, December.
Yeah, I think they're probably going to be the government. I don't think they'll get a majority, but that's sort of where it is.
It all depends where those votes lie, mate. I think they're going to be pretty big swings against them, but I think those swings may well not be of much use, that they will appear in their own, strongly held seats in their safe seats.
Well, I think they'll actually lose some of those, but
they may well. Well.
Do you think the Prime Minister will survive long post an election?
There seems to be a thought that he's not going to be around much in his second term for much of his second term. Yes. He got the house on the Central Coast.
Yeah,
that would indicate he's about to get married, so he's about to go through some fairly significant life-changing experiences that don't sit all that comfortably with political leadership.
And he's not really setting the world on fire. So I would be.
Look, let me say, if he wins and retains majority government, it's a big if. But let's say he does, then I think he would deserve a sort of moniker that he was a little bit like John Howard, in that he was good at electoral politics, but not much else.
Mm.
That's yet to be decided. We can talk about this in speculative terms. But if he's re-elected with a majority government, you would say, despite everything, and cost of living has been very, very brutal in Australia, and those things tend to kick governments out. But I think if they win that majority, you'd have to say, okay, well, he understands the electorate in that kind of way. We used to think John Howard had this kind of innate ability to assess what the problems of the country were at the time, or what people were thinking about the problems of the country at the time.
Yeah, Howard win 4 elections, I think, didn't he, on the bounce?
Yeah, that would only be 2 for Albo, but that's been my theory for a while, that Albo is kind of Labor's John Howard, Jack. We'll see. We'll see. He may not be around for that much. He might not be around at all, enforced after the next election. But if he is re-elected, he may not hang around that long.
Yeah.
What about women votes, Jack? I mean, the coalition just did terribly at the last election. Got absolutely belted. And in certain categories of women, particularly in professional younger women, the voters have just switched off the Liberal Party. But it would seem now that they're switching off both major parties to a large degree.
The women being particularly what the Americans call college-educated women being their own political outlier is not just in Australia and not just in the United States, but it's happening in places like South Korea and Germany as well. There's a real, and the United Kingdom, there's a huge divergence in political opinion between well-credentialed, well-educated women and the rest of the population.
Yes, there is, and
which is kind of curious, really.
Yeah, it's sort of a global phenomenon too, isn't it?
Yes, it is. Yeah. And I've heard no really coherent explanation for it, but it certainly does exist. On some issues, it's kind of 20% difference. 20.
Yeah. And let's, we hear we have a bit of a moan about both major parties, reform averse, risk averse, and maybe it's time for a bit of fresh blood through some of the minor parties, Jack.
Yeah, I just think there's something odd going on that we don't yet understand. We'll understand it someday, but we're not there yet.
Yeah, I think the Teals are going to go pretty well on the back of that. Strong women vote support, and I think they'll pick up. I'm not too sure about Kooyong, but I think they're going to pick one up anyway in the Northern Beaches in Bradfield, from what I'm being told.
In Kooyong, they seem to be picking up the Liberal Party's corflutes. And
that was an accident, Jack.
Yeah.
That man who was tearing that corflute down, that was an act of God, force majeure.
Your good pal John Ferguson in The Australian had a very lovely piece on that, and he pointed out something that I kind of knew about Monique Ryan, is that she is part of that what he called the Eastern Suburbs Catholic Mafia. She was Dux at Loretto. I think
Ferg's in it.
Yeah,
I think Ferg might be.
She was either Dux at either Loretto or Sacré-Cœur, one of the two. And I can remember, even in student politics at Melbourne Uni, that particularly the women, the Eastern Suburbs Catholic Mafia, you had to have a candidate on your slate who was going to appeal to them.
Yeah, look, I did see the vandalising of corflutes. I've always been amused by that name, Jack. I don't know where it comes from. I'd like to look at the etymology.
It certainly postdates my leaving Australia. I'd never heard of it when I left Australia.
Corflutes, which is just a poster. Why can't we just call it a poster, guys? Yeah. Anyway, I did see Basil Zamperis. He was having a bit of a whinge on Instagram because
this is the new Liberal leader in Western Australia now.
Yeah, he is. He's just
football commentator, mayor, and now a Liberal leader.
He's mercifully not doing as much football, Jack.
No.
He was on Instagram, and he was walking down a street in his electorate that he narrowly won, with a swing to him less than the state average, and he observed all the Labor posters were up, the corflutes were up, but his had all been taken down. And I suggested to him in comments, I said, maybe people just don't like you, Baz. And
I kind of wonder why people go to all the trouble of pulling these things down, because I don't really think they make much difference. But there was a funny incident some years ago in what used to be called the seat of Melbourne Ports is now called McNamara, I think.
Yeah, Macamara.
When Michael Danby was the candidate for the Labor Party, there were corflutes torn down between the hours of 2 and 3 a.m. And I think Bill Shorten was still leader, and he had to come out and say what a terrible thing this was, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It turns out one of his good mates was one of the people who was spending the 2 to 3 o'clock hour doing this. But
I provided a reference to the court when someone was charged, I think 2019, with tearing down the UAP poster. And we got him off the conviction anyway. So I'm not sure I like it all that much, but we better get moving on now, Jack.
That's good. It's excellent fun writing a court reference for a situation like that. I did one for one of our listeners, and it was a work of art. He came across as very much like Mother Teresa, except better fun.
Very nice. Well done. The golden age of magazines, Jack. Vanity Fair. A piece by Brian Burrow there, Jack. Tell me about it.
Oh, he's talking about this is when Graydon Carter was editor of Vanity Fair. And it's a bit like the golden age of publishing in Australia. It just looked like the money was never going to run out.
Stop. Yeah.
Yeah. So he said he hardly ever went to the office, but he was pulling $500,000 US. This is in the 1980s. 500,000 US was pretty damn good. And this was for writing 10,000 pieces a year.
Talk about lousy timing on my part, but anyway, look, Vanity Fair now, the website. I know the magazine still exists, and you could subscribe to it, and it was always.
But it's really a blog.
It's not great these days. It really is a choice between the Atlantic and Vanity Fair. Vanity Fair tends to more of the Hollywood stuff.
It was a great magazine in its day. It was very popular on both the coasts, but it didn't ever sell much in the middle of the country. But look, I first started reading it because the late great Christopher Hitchens went there, and then I discovered this fellow called Dominic Dunn, who was kind of a next generation Tom Wolfe, and he wrote wonderful stuff on the O.J. Simpson trial, for instance. And talk about the golden age. They put him up at the Chateau Marmont in LA for the entire duration of the trial.
Oh, it's lovely. Yeah. That's actually one of my dreams, to actually have one of the villas in the Chateau Marmont.
Yeah.
Yes, look, having worked in magazines...
The room service, I'm told, is excellent there. You can get anything that you want.
I'm sure you can, and it's always the way, listeners, if you're wondering about these things, go to the busboy first if you want something a bit more exotic. Yeah. It's the hierarchy overturned when it's the supply of marching powder and what have you.
There was a hotel in Melbourne. We just had the joke. There was a place where you could ring room service and order some Coke or a Coke.
Always go to the busboys first, particularly in LA. Yes, I worked with magazines of somewhat less repute than Vanity Fair. Picture and
one could say that, given you were
picture of people. I'm going to tell this story. Shield doesn't listen to this, so it doesn't matter. But my co-author and good friend Pat Shield, he was editor at Picture for quite some time. And we're just putting together a Wikipedia page for him, unbeknownst to him. Anyway, don't tell him, listeners. If you know him, just don't tell him. It's going to be a surprise. We're almost there. And he had this. He was editor at the time, and he had this idea. So this must have been early 90s. This is well before I knew him. It must have been early 90s because the dates of things. Heroin was a big issue in Sydney, late 80s, early 90s, or 80s and early 90s. And so Pat had this light bulb moment where the Picture were going to offer a prize to a heroin addict, and that heroin addict would be flown to Bangkok, where he would be collected by some Buddhist monks and taken away for a period of deprivation and solace and meditation and so forth, and get off the gear. And people were telling me that Shield would bail up the publisher, he'd bail up everybody just to get the money to do this, and he finally got it approved. It seems remarkable now to have such a thing. This was the competition. If you're a heroin dealer, write into us, and if you're the lucky winner, you'll be sent off to Thailand. So they did it, and they had a winner, and they bunged him on a plane. He was due to meet the Buddhist monks at the other end at Bangkok Airport. They bunged him on the plane, and he's never been seen again. So funny. I don't know how you think about these things. Have we gone backwards, Jack? In 2025, that is an inconceivable idea from magazine.
Just before we leave Vanity Fair, Toby Young, who wrote How to Lose Friends and Alienate People, about his time as a young man working at Vanity Fair, tells the story about hopping in the lift one morning and Christopher Hitchens dashing in behind him to get into the lift, and Christopher looking a little seedy, to say the least.
He often did look a little red in the face.
And Toby said, "Christopher, how are you today?" And the response was, "Too early to say."
God love him.
He was a loss to journalism.
Oh, look, he was just a wonderful, wonderful writer. I've got 3 or 4 of his books.
Even when you're not agreeing with him, the thing just flows off the page. It's a delight to read.
Beautiful speaker too, beautiful orator. Yeah. We're just pushing on a little bit, but we will go back, Jack. I just want to talk about what's going on in Turkey with protests raging there over a number of nights. Following the arrest of Istanbul's mayor, part of the largest demonstrations the country has seen in more than a decade. So, is Erdogan in trouble, Jack?
Well, I believe he would have to change the constitution I think he goes through till 2026, perhaps, or 2027.
2028, I think, yeah.
And then he would need to change the constitution he would be term limited or change the constitution. Yeah. But I'm starting to wonder whether he will be around to change the constitution. That it might be all over by then.
Yeah, maybe that's true. There was an enormous amount of strife after the earthquakes in southern Turkey, Jack. I don't know if you remember.
Yep.
Great furor about building quality, construction quality, and clearly Erdogan had a number of developers as his mates and benefactors.
Yep.
And it ended fairly quickly, and I thought this is the start of something, and maybe this is I'm going to think this is the start of something, and it might die just as easily. But there is in Turkey, of course, a big divide between what the people think in the major cities like Istanbul and Ankara, to rural Turks, and they have a very different view of the world.
And there are a lot of rural Turks. It's a bit like Iran. The same thing applies.
Yeah, exactly. All right, let's go back a bit. The United States, Jack, I think, the courts are standing firm, aren't they? We did have a moment there when some people were shifted off to El Salvador in breach of a court order, a federal court order. That everyone said, "Oh, we didn't know at the time," but the courts seem to be standing fairly strong at the moment, and that's kind of where I would direct our listeners to look to see just how much change there is in America.
A couple of decisions overnight, which I haven't read fully yet, coming back from that a little bit. I think 2 of the injunctions have been withdrawn or taken or thrown out. But yes, but these battles are not new. The most famous one goes right back to 1937 when Franklin Roosevelt was president, and he wanted to push through what was later called the New Deal, and he had a mandate to do that. He stood for election on doing this, and the courts were trying to stymie him. It got to the point where he had a bill drawn up to, I think, triple the size of the Supreme. I mean, his situation wasn't lower courts who were standing up to him. This was the Supreme Court who were standing up to him and saying, no, you can't do this New Deal stuff. So he proposed a
Which,
bill.
frankly, is bullshit, by the way. I mean, he had a thumping, a thumping mandate.
Yeah. He had so he said, well, look, I'm going to triple the size of the Supreme Court because the Constitution doesn't determine the size of the Supreme Court. That's decided by Congress.
And my wife will be Chief Justice.
Yeah, pretty
Well,
much.
not
yeah.
quite, but yeah.
Yeah. And this went backwards and forwards for a little bit. And then the court kind of adjusted itself to be a little more accommodating, if not entirely accommodating, to what he wanted to do with his mandate. And that's the most extreme example, the most colourful example. But there have been other ones of these. And this current kind of pushing backwards and forwards just isn't that unusual.
It isn't that unusual. I would say what's unusual is the rhetoric, certainly in contemporary times, in modern times, the rhetoric as espoused by the press secretary and others, where they're talking about politicised judges who are communists and all this sort of nonsense. It doesn't help.
Well, Roosevelt was pretty ferocious about this as well. This has happened before, and it will happen, and it will work itself out, is my view.
Yeah, all right. I did see Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, it's John Roberts, isn't it?
It is John Roberts, yes.
He gave Trump a little bit of a backhand a couple of weeks ago.
He did.
Stay in your lane sort of talk. All right, meanwhile,
The problem
what's
with
happening?
the staying in the lane thing is the lanes aren't necessarily, as clear. They haven't got little ropes like at Stall.
No, I understand. All right, Ukraine and Russia. Where are we, Jack? It's kind of all over the shop. Perhaps we're in the wrong group chats. There has been a proposal put to the Russians who've ignored it, or have said no, they're not doing it. We talk about a peacekeeping force in Ukraine. That's not possible at the moment. And indeed, Putin's requests are that there'll be a ceasefire if US aid is stopped, US intelligence sharing is stopped. These sorts of things that will almost certainly bring about the decline of Ukraine.
He wants a ceasefire like immediately in the Black Sea because he can't win anything there.
Well, there is a bit going on there. Apparently, I just saw a recent report saying that the Black Sea was now safe for shipping, which means it's safe for Russian shipping, Jack, because they're the only ones getting blown out of the water.
But he's less keen on a ceasefire because he thinks he's making some ground in eastern Ukraine.
Yeah. It's more than a scramble for as much territory as we can get before we have a ceasefire.
Yeah, that's right.
It's a drive.
Yeah.
Meanwhile, Jack, Israel, Gaza, we've spoken about Yemen getting bombed. Israel and Gaza, what have we got there? There's an Egyptian proposal. How far is that getting? How far has that got?
Not very far at all. Interestingly, this morning there was in northern Gaza there was a large anti-Hamas demonstration, and I've seen the video. Seems real. We'll have to wait and see how that plays out. But that's sort of going nowhere at the moment. But the Egyptians and I think the Saudis are working on stuff. So
why are the Israelis still bombing Gaza, Jack?
Why?
That's a pretty good question. Yeah, why? I mean, there's a ceasefire in place, isn't it? As shaky as it is.
I'm not sure the ceasefire is still operative, to be honest.
But I mean, legally and technically, it's in place, but it's
I think even legally and technically, that's arguable. But yeah.
And what's going on in the West Bank? I mean, I want to avoid using inflammatory words, but what's going on in the West Bank is pretty crook as well, isn't it? I mean, you're having people being removed from their homes that have been there for a very, very long time, and these are Palestinians, and I fully accept that some of them are activists, and some of them might be engaged with with violent activist groups, but we're not talking quagmire, but we are talking about a situation that is now very difficult to resolve. I mean, it's always been very difficult to resolve. Let me put it this way: that I don't. Well, the two-state solution is dead. All we can really hope for is that Gaza will be stripped of all the rubble taken away, and then Palestinians can return there, and then what? I mean, this is going to be a running sore in 100 years' time, isn't it?
Yep. Well, like most of these things, the only solution is someone wins.
Yeah, I know. But there's victories. I mean, we could talk about medieval battles and strategic victories and things like that. What we are really talking about now is that if someone wins, that means the other side is obliterated.
Well, it means they lose. That's certainly true. Yeah.
All right. Interesting stuff in the Middle East there.
The anti-Hamas demonstration this morning is the most hopeful thing I've seen for a while.
Yeah. And when was that?
This morning.
No, sorry, I meant when. Where was that? Sorry.
Northern Gaza.
Okay.
Yeah, because if there were some alternative to Hamas and indeed to the PLO, then that might make a two-state solution possible.
Indeed, yeah. All right, one to watch.
I think there can be no two-state solution with Hamas and probably not with the Palestine Authority either. But if there were alternatives to that may well be possible.
Okay. Well, let's have a little. I mean, look, I don't expect things to change quickly, but let's have a deeper look at it perhaps next week. Canada now, a snap election has been called for April 28. What are we talking? It's really only just a 4-week. Yeah, that's a typical one. If you're going to get, if you're looking like getting beaten, go the short campaign.
Well, they're back in the game. Yeah,
they are. Yeah, I suppose that's true. And this is all the Trump stuff, and. So we've got Mark Carney. He was actually he was on the board of the Bank of England, wasn't he?
He was the chairman of the Bank of England.
Chairman.
Yeah.
Okay.
Which is a very powerful position in the UK. Yeah.
I know that. I noticed a few Tories, UK Tories, were given a bit of a slapping, including that fine politician who was. Prime Minister for 44 days, Jack?
Miss Truss.
Miss Truss, yeah. You sort of look at her and go, look, you've lost your seat. You were Prime Minister for an embarrassingly short period of time. Then you lost your seat when an election was finally called. Why are you still here? I mean, do you have any hobbies? Is there something would you like to do? Landscape art. Would you like to go fishing? I mean, get the fuck out of here.
Well, I can understand why she's still there, because if she maintains some degree of notoriety, she can pick up a speaking fee.
Yeah, I guess that's it, isn't it? She did have the book out, which was, again, embarrassing in terms of sales. What's your tip for the Canadian election this far out, Jack? You reckon Carney will get the Liberals home?
No, I think that when push comes to shove, the Liberals have been there for too long.
Yeah, I think that's right. And that places a great deal of pressure on the Conservatives and particularly the leadership, because it's, they have similar views to Trump, but they must maintain this national, this pro-Canada view. Otherwise, they will lose the support of Canadians.
Yeah. I have fun. I have fun rubbishing the Canadians because I just say to my American friends, "Look, they're your Kiwis. We don't like our Kiwis much."
There's nothing wrong with the Kiwis, mate. How dare you speak darkly about them? Look, it's going to be really interesting. I mean, you know that Vance is going to Greenland I think he's probably there now.
I thought it was Mrs. Vance who's going to
The
Greenland.
Mrs. Vance was going, unless I'm correct, I just got a little bit of a briefing on this rather than reading anything about it, that he's decided he's going to go as well. The Greenland Prime Minister is going, what are these people doing? You don't really want them here. They're not popular. It's not as if they're going to, I mean, Jesus Christ, if you're going to have J.D. Vance win over the populace, he's probably the wrong hire for that. And then you've got Canada, you've got Panama Canal. You've got Canada where they're just insisting that it's. I mean, I don't know. How does that play out? The Canadians are never going to become the 51st state of the United States.
No. Besides, if you were being sensible about it, they'd have to become the 51st, the 52nd, and the 53rd.
Yeah, what's wrong with Puerto Rico?
Because you'd want to cut it up into chunks.
Well, poor old Puerto Rico, they've been the 51st state for a long time, the wannabe 51st state, but Donald...
But they'd probably say yes.
I think they would. Yeah. I think if you're born in Puerto Rico, you aren't a US citizen. I think that's the way it works, but you can fast-track to US citizenship.
You can, yes.
And it has very close relationship with the United States.
It's a bit akin to the old British overseas national situation where they weren't quite citizens, but they were citizen adjacent, shall we say?
Like the good people of Guam. EU, Jack. Now look, you'll be salivating over the prospect of a good old Europe bash as usual. So what are we doing this week, mate?
Oh no, I just thought it was interesting that the German government, what looks like the new government, keep talking about they think they've been orphaned by the US, and this is happening in the UK, that they think that Europe's being abandoned by the. I don't quite see that, but this is something that's taken hold in political circles, at least in Europe and the UK.
Well, you could almost written off NATO two or 3 weeks ago. It's still there, but
yeah, there are still 30,000.
You have to ask, what's America's problem? What is Trump and Vance? What's their problem with Europe? They feel like they've been slighted over the journey. What is it?
Well, I think like every US president for 30 years, they've wanted, because all of them have said to Europe, you have to pay your share. You have to be real contributors.
Well, that seems to be happening now. So
it does seem to be moving that way. I think Denmark's up to about 3% of GDP on spending on defence. The Poles are doing a better job than anyone else in the world, I think. But the rest are not.
Yeah, but we'd have to say
which
the
is
Americans or the Trump administration hasn't exactly screamed out of the blocks in terms of economic management, has it? I mean, there is a real prospect of an American recession this year.
That's a possibility, yes.
But
even
on the basis of tariffs.
Even though it's not going great, it's still going better than the EU. The economy in the EU is pretty terrible.
Yeah, well, it might be slow and low growth, but it's not negative growth, mate. So you can't say it's terrible. I mean, basically, since Trump's been elected, for the 2-month period, December, January, February, so that was the quarter, negative growth of 3.8. You have another month like that, or you have another quarter like that, you are in recession.
Yeah,
but not just barely. You're in big heaps. The labour market seems to be holding up at the moment, but yeah, you couldn't think of a worse time to impose tariffs other than 1930. 1930-31, after the collapse of the equities markets around the world. So we've got slow, mediocre growth globally around the world, and then you've got the biggest economy that's basically decided it's almost going to shut down. Ain't
Yeah,
going to be
well,
good.
We'll have to see. What's happening in sport?
Let's have a look at sport. Well, of course, let's say our farewells to the great George Foreman, Jack, one of the great fighters of the 70s era, and then he backed up and became a veteran and won the title again.
At 40-something, wasn't it?
Yeah, he's well into his 40s. I think maybe 48, very close to 50. And he was just that big man, just kept coming forward. You could hit him in the head. You could smack him around, but he just keep coming. And then when he hit you, bang, see you later. He made an absolute mess of Joe Frazier in the fight before the Rumble in the Jungle. And I think he knocked Frazier down probably about 8 times in the space of 2 rounds. And then, of course, we did have the Rumble in the Jungle, and Ali's people used to try and keep Ali away from watching. They used to both train at different times in Sissy Seiko's palace, presidential palace, and there were times when Ali would walk in and his miners would try and keep him away because George was working on the heavy bag and just putting great big dents in it, and they didn't want Muhammad Ali to see it. He did see it, and go, of course, that's where Foreman lost the title to Muhammad Ali, and after that fight, he was such a favourite to win. He really became a recluse for the next 3 or 4 years.
He did.
And then he got out and he made a fortune. He had the grilling machine and all that sort of stuff.
The George Foreman grill, yes.
George Foreman grill. He had how many George Foreman juniors did he have? Children?
Oh, quite a lot. They had lots of kids.
Yeah, a very, very large man. But, there was a great humility about him as well.
He became a pastor.
Yeah. Well, Valet to him dead at 74. That's not bad for a boxer, Jack.
No, it's not.
Not bad at all. That must take us to the AFL.
How do you score 100 points? Your best player and captain has 35 or so touches and kicks 4 goals, and you still get a belting. You still get a 10-goal belting.
That's the Essendon v Adelaide Crows game?
Adelaide Crows, yeah.
Well, it's pretty easy.
You've got no defence.
Neither side were all that strong defensively. Adelaide,
particularly Essendon, yeah.
Essendon, when Adelaide had the ball, they weren't even lines of defence. They could just step around them. Yeah, the Bombers are probably just going at the moment. There's constant talk about whether they're in a rebuild, and it's almost something a coach can't admit to. I saw the Essendon coach talking about this last night. The trouble is with Brad Scott, they've given him another year, Jack, at the start of the season. I don't understand that.
No, nor do I. All of the theorists tell me that it's because they want some certainty so that you can go out and recruit people by saying, this bloke's going to be the coach. I don't think that makes much difference, to be quite honest.
Yeah, I can certainly understand the Essendon coach wanting an extra year, but I'm not quite sure why a club or a board of a football club wouldn't be saying to them, well, why don't we talk at the end of the season?
Yes.
Who's your most impressive side so far, Jack?
Well, Adelaide have been pretty good, but yeah. Hawthorn have been Adelaide haven't really played anyone yet, but Hawthorn have been far and away the best team going around at the moment, I think.
Look, you're right about Adelaide. They probably haven't had great opposition just yet, but they possess the same sort of skill levels that Hawthorn do. That's just that piercing 45, 50-metre kick that breaks defensive lines or goes straight over the top of them. And it's looking increasingly like a game that is built around kicking skills more and more and more. 30 years ago, Travis Page, we're going back a bit further than 30. Travis Page, I remember, was a terrible kick. Rod Austin, the guys couldn't kick the footy. I mean, they'd learnt enough to be able to kick the ball long, but they weren't natural kicks. I think those days are over.
My theory is that comes from AFL sides have a defence now that looks more like basketball or soccer. So they set up really well, and you've got to be able to find a way through that to pierce that, as you said. And having a great kick is a good way of doing that. But it's not just about having great kicks in the team. You've got to have your great kicks have got to get the ball with a little bit of space so they can exercise that skill. One of the reasons I think that Sydney dropped off last year was their best kick, Errol Goulden, was played as an inside mid as the season went on. So he's getting the ball where he's just throwing the ball on the boot rather than where you should be getting the ball, which is a bit wider when he can do something with it.
He should be a wingman, yeah. Look, I saw the Carlton-Hawthorn game. I thought Carlton's effort was pretty good, unlike the week before. But talking about their kicking, I think it was Ambrosio, the Hawthorn back. He was under a bit of pressure in the back pocket, and he delivered a 50-metre pass that just hit his teammate on the wing, and they went forward and they kicked a goal. The game was in the balance. Well, kind of in the balance. It was the last quarter, and Carlton were having a go, and it just killed them. It was just the most beautiful, exquisite kick under pressure. Left footers. I think they seem to like the left footers too, Jack, the recruiters, Jack.
Well, they did back in 2008. They went and consciously recruited left footers. If you look at that 2008 Hawthorn side, Hodge, from Hodge right through to Xavier Ellis, all these left footers who could kick the ball beautifully. James Sicily is just about as good a player as there is playing, I think, at the moment.
He's a great leader of Hawthorn, and look, I've seen them play, I think, 3 times now. They've played 3 games, haven't they? And they look cherry ripe. They beat Sydney in Sydney, which is a real feat. They beat Carlton last week, and I think I'm just trying to think who they beat, but they've looked so impressive every time. Yeah, wonderfully coached, I think, and I'm I've never been a huge fan of the Hawthorn Footy Club, but I honestly expected them to be in a rebuild mode for a long time, Jack, but it's taken them really less than 3 years.
Yeah. Yeah, no, well, even if you look back at last year, in the second half of the year, they and Brisbane were going better than everybody.
Yeah,
in the second half of the year.
So Brisbane looked good as well. As you say, Adelaide and Hawthorn are the 2 form sides in the competition. They don't hand out premierships in March or April, form and things can decline, but there are a number of disappointments. I think Carlton would be one of them. I think Fremantle are a bit of a disappointment.
That's 9 losses out of 11 for Carlton.
Yeah, I know. And they seem to have 2, there is talk about their list and it being a bit brittle, but they've got too few doing too much. Cripps and Tom de Koning. Basically, I reckon they'd be, vying for each other for Brownlow leadership across the comp, but they're getting next to no support from some of their defenders. I think they're going to bring a good one in. And you just sort of wonder. I hope Carlton don't go through that terrible process again of sacking a coach and then going through the hiring process. It's just not something that this club needs to do.
And it's hardly ever just the coach, by the way.
Oh, look, their list isn't quite good enough. I know there was criticism of Curnow for playing. He looked very short of a gallop, barely touched it against Hawthorn. He'll be better for the run. He's a good player, but yeah, then you've got Mackay, who just expect him to have a really good year. I thought he had a great year last year, as opposed to the one before with a lot of kicking problems and missed easy goals and stuff like that. Had a good year, but you expect him to keep going, and it seems to have gone backwards, if anything. Too early to say.
I did like seeing Jack Silvani out there just because he's a footballer rather than an athlete, and it's good to see one of them having a good day.
Yeah, look, he's turned into a swing man now, going down back. I'm not sure that Brodie Kemp is the answer as the sort of second or third tall forward. I'd prefer to see Silvani in that role, but we'll see. The Suns are looking pretty good too, Jack. Well, they'll have their moments. The Giants have won a couple of games. Collingwood have lost one and won two. They look pretty good.
Yeah.
And they got rolled who beat them in the first round?
Was it the Giants?
It was the Giants, wasn't it? Yeah. And I was on the group chat with a couple of rusted on Collingwood barrackers, and they wrote them off, mate. They wrote Collingwood off after the first round. Very funny. Yeah, so look, and the other one that I think could surprise this year is North Melbourne. I watched them on the weekend. They look really good. That was a very good win against
Melbourne.
Western Bulldogs.
Melbourne?
Oh, Melbourne, of course. Yes, it was. God, gee whiz, thank you, mate. And look, Melbourne have got plenty of talent and plenty of weapons, but North are really emerging as a strong midfield with weapons up forward. They've got I don't know if you've seen him play. There's a number 30. His name is Charlie Comben. And he's had a lot of injury and so forth. He's still a young player, hasn't played a lot of footy. A tall defender, like a sort of Jacob Wiedering sort of guy. Certainly played the best football he's probably ever played at that level. He would have taken, just in the third quarter alone, I reckon he would have taken about 5 or 6 intercept marks. So they've got plenty there's not a lot missing. There's not a lot missing at North Melbourne. And they've got a pretty crafty coach, and they're a well-organised club with a fair bit of dough. So that's another one to watch. The Cats were disappointing, I thought, last week too. But, they get 7 home games every year, and it just seems to me to be an advantage that other clubs don't have.
That's probably right. They've got a nice young kid. I think he played his first game. I saw the weekend. Where's number 14? Played as an intercept defender, really, and he was terrific. For a kid playing his first game, looked like he played 100.
NRL. I don't know if you read this, but the Australian sports journalist, Andrew Webster was talking about Gus Gould and his influence. I'm not talking about it.
I did read that.
Did you read that? Yeah. What do you make of Gus? I've never been a fan. I'll say that up front.
I've never met the man, but living in the eastern suburbs of Sydney in the days when he was at the Roosters, I met a lot of people who did know him, and he's no one's ever on the fence about this.
No, it's one way or the other, isn't it?
Everyone's got a strong opinion and will happily tell you. And,
well, my old mate Rabs reckons he's tripolar. Did you see?
Yeah,
he reckons Gus is tripolar. This is a lot of journalists talk about this, and a lot of sort of friends and others. He'll just brush you, and that'll be it. You ring him and he won't pick up the phone and all that sort of stuff. He certainly has it's a very rugby league thing that you do have these very influential people in it, a sprinkling of them. I just thought it was a fascinating thing. Now,
there are always half a dozen really big personalities who dominate the competition, it seems to me.
Yeah. Now, one great story that wasn't told in that magazine,
Bullfrog Moore out at Canterbury.
Canterbury, yeah. But one story that wasn't told in this article on Gus last week, Gus moved out to Yowie Bay. He would have been there at least 20 years now. But he bought the house off George Foreman. And there's plenty going on there over the years when George was running the household. And Gus, bless him, reckons whenever he has to go in the garden do a bit of digging, he's always very careful. Not quite sure what he'll dig up. Could be a few bones there. So yes, he is the current, or has been for many years, been the resident at Yowie Bay, the Freeman Mansion. Good effort from Melbourne, but I noticed their coach gave them a bake because the Panthers, they let the Panthers in a little bit when Cleary went down with an injury, and Storm were well in front. They ended up just winning by the one converted try. But that's a fair effort at home. But Melbourne again, look at them. Look at them. There they are.
Well managed, well coached.
Yeah, on top of the ladder. Bulldogs, again, that's the Gus influence, good or bad. They're doing very well. And the Eels, well, they just look terrible. They look like they're going to be the easy beats of the competition. And so do the Dolphins and the Cowboys, by the way. All righty, well, that just about takes us out unless you've got something really silly. It has to be sillier, Jack. I have to warn you. It has to be sillier than the Signal national security leaks in the United States.
No, I can't top that. Not this week.
I think that's a fair and reasonable conclusion to come to. It cannot be topped. All right. Well, we want to thank our listeners for calling in once again. We did get a little bit of feedback. We'll publish a bit more. And I've just checked my email, and my editor loves me. So it's a beautiful world, and we do look forward to hearing from you. Drop us a line if you want us to explore some of the ugly politics or some of the sort of political nature of things just on the cusp of an election here. What you think we think about it. We've sort of given it a little bit of it away, but we are coming into a very busy time, Jack, podcast wise.
Yeah, I must say that when I got the report back from my brain scan, and it said that my brain was normal, there were several people of my acquaintance who said, "I think they've messed the scans up with somebody else."
Hang on, I was holding it upside down. Yeah. No, good to hear you well, mate. Keep on punching. You'll land one day.
No hope of that.
And look, listeners, once again, just drop us a line. You get hold of me on my X account. I still do play in it from time to time, particularly amusing things like what happened yesterday in DC. And you can also get hold of Jack and give his Substack a bit of a look too. Give us that address again, please, mate.
HongKongJack.substack.com. I haven't actually finished anything for a while. But
dear. Come on, Jack. You're going to be a bloody writer. You got to write. All right. Well, we'll see you later, folks. You take care. See ya.
Cheers.